Over on Purple Insider, a new Vikings history video is out about the time that Bud Grant, during a game against the Detroit Lions, only showed up to the game 5 minutes before kickoff. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. Excluding Anthony Munoz, if you ask people who the greatest player in the history of the Cincinnati Bengals was, odds are they would say that it was this man right here, the legendary quarterback, Ken Anderson. He should absolutely be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and it's somewhat ridiculous that he's not enshrined yet, because he truly was one of the best quarterbacks of his era. This was a man who guided the Bengals to Super Bowl 16, a man who led the league in passing yards twice, a man who led the league in completion percentage 3 times, and a guy who won the MVP during that 1981 season, which is somewhat remarkable considering the fact that he was fighting for his starting job at the start of the season. Ken Anderson was a heck of a player, and he's widely regarded as a Bengals legend and an NFL legend for just how good he was throughout the 70s and the first half of the 1980s. And while his 1981 MVP season was spectacular, the 1982 season, as crazy as it might seem to believe, might have been even better. Sure, it's tough to really gauge how good it was and how it compared to 1981, since the 1982 season was a strike-shortened season, as only 9 games were played. However, if it wasn't Dan Fouts, he might have been the best quarterback in the entire league that season. In 1982, Anderson completed 70.6% of his passes, which not only led the league, and not only was a career high, but set an NFL record at the time for the highest completion percentage ever in a single season. To date, this ranks as the 7th highest completion percentage ever, and it wasn't until 2011, when Drew Brees did it, that the record was broken, standing for close to 3 decades. In fact, by this point in NFL history, only one other quarterback, Sammy Baugh in 1945, had a completion percentage in a single season above 67%. So to say that Anderson's season was historic would be putting it lightly. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, he guided the Bengals to a playoff appearance with a 7-2 record, led the league in passer rating with a rating of 95.3, made it to the Pro Bowl, and if the season was a full 16-game season, would have been on pace for over 4,400 yards, which would have ranked as one of the highest totals in league history. In all likelihood, you know about how good of a quarterback Ken Anderson was, and you know how great he was, especially during that 1982 season. But in all likelihood, you know about his contributions as a quarterback. What you might not know is that during that 1982 season, he was almost tasked with playing completely out of position, and was almost assigned with being the team's kicker. That's right. Imagine today, if Patrick Mahomes had to kick for the Kansas City Chiefs, and the best quarterback in the league doubled up as a kicker completely by accident. Well, prior to Cincinnati's 1982 game against the Baltimore Colts, that's almost what happened. And this is the story behind how Ken Anderson almost suited up for the Bengals, in the prime of his career, at kicker. Before I talk about Anderson and his kicking ability, and why he was almost supposed to be the team's kicker, we need some context to understand the importance of this game, as well as who the team's original kicker was. It's December 5th, 1982. It's the 5th week of the 9-week abbreviated season, and as we hit the midway point of one of the strangest years in NFL history, and I think that goes without saying, we have an AFC battle on our hands over at Memorial Stadium between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Baltimore Colts. For the Bengals, this was an absolutely monumental game for a few reasons. Number one, even though they were off to a great start, sitting at 3-1, there were also 5 other teams in the AFC with a 3-1 record, and 3 others at 2-2. 8 teams in each conference made the playoffs, and the top 4 teams hosted the first-round games, since there were no divisions and no bye weeks. So even though Cincy was 3-1, they didn't have a lot of room for error, since a loss could drop them from one of the best teams in the AFC to a team having to play on the road. or even a team out of the playoff picture entirely. But number 2, this was a big game because they were playing the worst team in football in the Baltimore Colts. There were 28 teams in the NFL, and by this point, 27 of them had wins. The lone team that didn't? The Baltimore Colts, who were 0-4, boasted the worst offense in the league by scoring just 33 points, or barely over 8 points per game, boasted the worst defense in the league by allowing 105 points, or over 26 points per game, and boasted the worst point differential in the league at -72. This was a golden opportunity against the worst team in football that the Bengals, quite simply, had to take advantage of. No questions asked. And if they were going to do it, aside from the obvious of needing a great game out of their star quarterback, Ken Anderson, they were going to need their kicker, this man right here, Jim Breech, to have a good day at the office. Breech had been the team's kicker since 1980, and so far, in 1982, he was having a pretty good season, going 8 for 11 and hitting over 72% of his kicks. That might not sound even the slightest bit impressive by today's standards. However, in 1982, considering the fact that the league-wide average was just 68%, that's pretty good. Breech was one of the better kickers in football, and was on a hot streak as of late, having not missed a kick since the strike ended, going 4 for 4, including a game against the Philadelphia Eagles where he not only went 3 for 3 in an 18-14 victory, but hit a 49-yard field goal at the end of the first half. By the time the 1982 season ended, Breech was actually the 7th most accurate kicker in the league. So while there were many reasons for the team being successful in 1982, and picking up right where they left off from their AFC champion season the previous year in 1981, solid and consistent play on special teams, particularly when it came to their kicker in Jim Breech, was one of them. Heck, one writer said at the start of December that he had the Bengals playing in Super Bowl 17, and cited the reliable nature of the kicking game and kicker Jim Breech as reasons why they were going to go all the way. So with all of that being said, you'd figure that he would be the kicker going into the team's game against the Baltimore Colts. He was feeling healthy. He was playing well. He was leading the entire AFC in scoring with 33 points. And he was locked in and was ready to go. However, during practice on Thursday, December 2nd, just 3 days before the game, Breech was kicking, and he pulled a groin muscle in his left leg. Now in theory, this shouldn't be a huge deal, seeing as Breech was a right-footed kicker. However, he needed to pivot on his left leg, since he was a soccer-style kicker. So if the left leg was hurting, that was no good. Initially, it didn't seem like a huge problem. Breech didn't feel the pull when he had that kick gone wrong, and if he did, it wasn't a huge deal, and was one of those things where he could shake it off, or so he thought. But when Breech was driving and getting out of his car after practice, he realized that something was wrong, and he felt like he was in some serious pain. Whatever, it's probably just general soreness from practice, like one usually feels. It should go away soon. However, when Breech got home, and when he woke up the next day, the pain was still there. It was a sharp pain that left him unable to do much of anything. Said Breech, "I just don't know how it happened. I just know it hurts. It's pretty sore right now. The way I feel right now, I can't kick very far. I just don't know right now. All I can do right now is ice it and hope." This was a big blow to the Bengals, as they were potentially going to be without their starting kicker. And you would think that the natural solution for this would be to sign a kicker off the street, right? You would think that Cincinnati would be inquiring about who could possibly kick for them on a temporary basis. And it's not like they didn't have options. In 1981, the Bengals drafted a kicker named Rex Robinson out of Georgia, as they took him in the 6th round with pick number 146. While he was unable to beat out Breech for the starting job, he was obviously familiar with head coach Forrest Gregg and the team, and he was a free agent, seeing as the New England Patriots just cut him on November 25th, 1 week before. This was a guy who was fresh, who was in game shape, who just played a few weeks ago, and who knew the team. So again, it's not like the Bengals didn't have options to sign a kicker. However, they chose not to. Instead, despite everything regarding Jim Breach's injury, the plan was to have tight end Ronnie Holman handle kickoffs, and none other than this man right here, their starting quarterback, Ken Anderson, served double duty as the team's kicker on extra points and field goals. You might be asking yourself, seriously? This is a must-win game against the worst team in football, and instead of having an actual kicker in there, you're seriously going to have this guy right here, your starting quarterback, doing that job? It's very similar to the situation a few years later involving the 1989 Atlanta Falcons, where their starting quarterback, Chris Miller, had to serve as the emergency kicker for the game, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, at least with that, the injury to the kicker came during warm-ups, so it's not like you had any options or had any time to prepare. This was well before the game was going to take place. You had ample time to prepare and find a replacement. Can Anderson even kick a football? Well, yes and no. Anderson actually had some experience at Augustana as a kicker. During the 1969 season, he made 6 field goals, which was a school record at the time, although that has since been long surpassed. However, that's not to say he was a good kicker. We don't have exact stats about percentages and whatnot, but during the 1970 season, Augustana scored 152 points, and Anderson made just 2 field goals and 9 extra points, which seems on the low side for a total that high. Plus, there's the obvious thing, which is that Anderson had not kicked since his college days, which were more than a decade ago, seeing as he was now a 33-year-old quarterback. This was December of 1982, and the last time he kicked in a game was in November of 1970. Disco wasn't a thing, then became a thing, then became the biggest thing in the world, then died, and there were still years left over all in the span of the last time Anderson kicked in a game. Michael Jackson had just released his Christmas album with the Jackson 5 the last time he kicked. Now, he was a few days removed from releasing Thriller. That's how long ago he last kicked a football. So by no means was this a good option, especially because the practice with Anderson did not seem to go that well, seeing as afterwards, wide receiver Chris Collinsworth said, "Now here's a guy who can't kick." No, he didn't actually say that, but he did say, "Rumor has it, we're going for 2 this week," which tells you everything, seeing as the 2-point conversion did not exist at the NFL level. Which raises the obvious question. Why is this likely the first time that you're hearing about Ken Anderson having to kick in a game? Well, that's because despite the terrible and comically bad planning on the part of the Bengals, they dodged a bullet. Because in the end, despite preparing for Anderson to be their kicker, Jim Breach made somewhat of a recovery and was healthy enough to kick the extra points, which is why all of the highlights of this game involve Anderson at quarterback and not at the kicker position. Now, that's not to say that Breach did all of the kicking, as the team was sort of cautious, as tight end Ronnie Holman handled the kickoffs. But the team did not attempt any field goals that day, and Breach went 2 for 3 on the extra points, as the Bengals, despite being 14.5-point favorites, won a surprisingly close game, taking it over the winless Colts by a final score of 20-17, after the Colts missed a field goal late in the 4th quarter. It was another great day at the office for Anderson, and maybe one of the best games of his career, as he went 22 for 29 with 206 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, and a passer rating of 129.4. But he did not have to do any kicking, which for his sake was probably a good thing, especially if the joking comments made by Collinsworth after the practice were anything to go off of. And for what it's worth, Anderson, despite playing until 1986 and having a 16-year career never kicked in a game. So this truly was a one-time emergency thing. Ken Anderson was a heck of a quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals. Not just during the 1982 season, and not just during this game against the Colts, but for his entire career. But on this December day in 1982, he was this close to being more than a quarterback. Because on this day, thanks to some bizarre roster management on the part of the Bengals and a fluke injury, he was this close to being Ken the Kicker. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.